can go ahead and we'll get us started. So I want to welcome everyone tonight to another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar. My name is Brian Garvey. I'm the organizer at Mass Peace Action. And for those of you who may not know us, we are the largest grassroots peace organization in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have over 1,000 dues-paying members and over 9,000 supporters here in the state. And what we do, what we've dedicated ourselves to, is fighting the evil of militarism. And several areas of work. We work to prevent military intervention and sanctions all across the world, but in Latin America as well. We fight for Palestinian rights, fight for nuclear disarmament. We do work on racial justice and decolonization. We work to make the connection between peace and climate as well. And we also work, and this is the subject of our webinar tonight, to end war in the Middle East. Wars now in the Middle East are going on for almost 2 decades. So tonight, we are joined by Professor Robert Vitalis, and we're going to be talking about the long relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. We've titled our program tonight, No Deal, where the myth of a US-Saudi special relationship comes from and why we believe it. Our featured speaker tonight is Professor Robert Vitalis of the University of Pennsylvania. He teaches political science there, and he is an expert on the US-Saudi relationship and its connection to the global reliance on oil and petroleum. He's the author of a forthcoming book, Oilcraft, The Myths of Scarcity and Security That Haunt US Energy Policy. And he's written another book on the subject. This came out in 2006. It was titled America's Kingdom, Mythmaking on the Saudi Oil Frontier. And that was named Book of the Year by The Guardian. I believe Professor Vitalis was telling me earlier that his new book will be on shelves. Did you say, was it June or July?
Oh, with Amazon, apparently in July. And if you write to Stanford University Press right now, they'll send you one. And like I said, I don't have one yet, but my cousin got one today. So
it's truly a forthcoming book. It should
Yeah.
be out very soon. And I'm looking forward to reading it. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Professor Vitalis.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation. I hope I don't drive you crazy, but it's going to be a short presentation and some give and take. But if you bear with me, if you follow the argument, maybe pick up the book if you need more evidence for it. Why I think it matters to the left is it provides us a better, stronger oppositional stance to the US-Saudi relationship, whatever that is. And what I want to try to do tonight is take our kind of reigning ideas apart about what that relationship is. And it's based on a chapter of Oilcraft. And now, if you hear that word Oilcraft, right, you might be thinking, I see, like a variant of statecraft, but one that recognizes, the centrality of oil to national security, to US power and the like, the way most specialists in US foreign policy and journalists and public intellectuals imagine it and repeat it like a mantra. But that's not what I mean. What I say Oilcraft, and it's like witchcraft. That's what I want to evoke for you tonight, because as you know, many centuries ago, men of science, ordinary people, believed in witches, and we know that witches don't exist. And then the question becomes, what kinds of evidence were constantly being produced for a phenomenon that's in fact a myth, non-existent. Well, in roughly the same way, I think we attribute, for lack of a better term, magical powers to oil, okay? When all it is a commodity that you buy and sell on the world market like any other commodity, right? But that is definitely not how folks think about it, right? Instead, oil is giving, as I said, all these like kind of magic powers. This idea that we need to control it, or now secure access to it, or stabilize prices, or prevent hostile powers from holding the world economy hostage. All these ideas, which we believe in, repeat, argue against, they also have no basis in fact. There's nothing the United States has ever had to do to secure the flow of oil, because oil just is bought and sold on the world market like any other commodity. Now, in the book, I try to show where these ideas come from and why they're wrong, but we're going to talk about Saudi Arabia tonight. And the reason I want to do that is, it seems to me nothing demonstrates the power Oilcraft holds over us, its undiminished power to disarrange and misdirect thought, than our beliefs about the United States-Saudi so-called special relationship. So you guys, you folks are smart. You think about questions of power, strategy, hegemony all the time. I want you to think about what that idea of the US-Saudi special relationship is, right? You know how people talk about it these days. There's some kind of alliance, tacit, formal, between the United States and Saudi Arabia that goes back decades, based on the idea of a trade for, right? The alliance is based on something called oil for security. Tom Friedman, after 9/11, kind of denigrated that a little bit by saying, we don't have a special alliance, we have a deal. To refresh your minds, I want to play you a clip where someone lays out this idea of something happening in 1945 that we're still living with. So if you let me do this for a second, let's see. Let's do that. So there I am on a panel with Bill Hartung, Raj Jarar, and introducing the panel is Phyllis Bennis. And that's a panel coming from a 2-day meeting that Medea Benjamin organized in 2016, a summit on Saudi Arabia. I just want you to listen to Phyllis for a few minutes.
Our government maintains with this absolute monarchy in Riyadh. Now, I'm going to speak briefly now and then introduce our other brilliant speakers. And I thought what I would do first is sort of lay out a bit of a timeline of US-Saudi relations. Sort of what does it look like, and when did it start, and why, just to kind of get us all on the same page, if you will. So 1932, it goes back much further, obviously, but I'm going to jump ahead a lot. 1932, Saudi Arabia becomes an independent state. This is in the period after World War I, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Already, US oil companies were involved in explorations of oil in Saudi Arabia. But only 1 year after independence, in 1933, the first official oil concession from the new state is given to Standard Oil of California in the creation of Aramco, what was called Saudi Aramco. It was made up of a consortium of 4 US-based oil companies. Then a few years later, 1945, after World War II, you have the famous meeting between FDR and then King Saud. They meet on a warship near the Suez Canal, where the great pledge is made that amounts, it's technical how they word it, but the essence of it is a quid pro quo. We'll guarantee access to oil, although it wasn't only about access, it was more about control. And you will provide protection, whether that means arms or sending troops, nuclear weapons. Nobody really knew at the moment what it was going to look like, but we will keep you under some kind of a military umbrella. You will give us all the oil that we need. Remember, this is in the context of the Cold War. So the context is all about anti-communism.
So I'm done sharing that screen. Is that right? Or are we still there?
No. You're all good, Bob.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So that was all made up. There's zero evidence for the claim that Phyllis just made about what was said on the USS Quincy between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Ibn Saud. Made up. Okay, we have the transcripts. I've read them in Arabic and in English. I have the records from Ibn Saud's own cabinet meetings. Okay, nothing like that happened. Right. So when she's making a claim that a deal was cut and here's what they said, it is being conjured out of thin air. Okay. Now here's the interesting thing. And many of you, here's the deal. If you Google today, US-Saudi special relationship, every picture, you'll get tons of pictures of that meeting on the USS Quincy, okay? This has become, it's a myth, but it's become the newest basic truth about the US-Saudi relationship going back to 1945. Here's the funny thing about it. Just think about this for a second. Supposedly a deal was cut in 1945 between these two leaders, okay, that established the US-Saudi relationship. Well, and I go through this in my book in some detail. No book on the US-Saudi relationship in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s say anything like that. Most of them don't even discuss Roosevelt being there because it's irrelevant to a story. I can, if Joe Gerson's in the audience, back when I knew him, we were talking about Nadav Safran's CIA funded study about Saudi defense policy. And his big, thick 600-page book, you go dig in there, you will see that no one talks about Roosevelt because it didn't happen. Or let me put it this other way. The meeting happened, but for all the time until literally 9/11, because here's the deal, that is a myth created after 9/11. And it is a myth sponsored fundamentally by Saudi Arabia. And yet here we are in the left embracing it as if it were this, kind of a key truth. This is how I hear Phyllis and Media Benjamin did the same thing. She was giving talks on her new book at the same time. It's as if it's the original sin about US foreign policy since 1945. Well, no book talks about that until after 9/11. Okay, 9/11, the people who love that story about Roosevelt and Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy are the Saudis themselves. So if you go to the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C., you'll see those pictures, supersized, the picture that is now ubiquitous describing the US-Saudi relationship. But no one talked about this relationship going back to the Quincy before 9/11, okay? Within 6 months, right? I'm not, this isn't conspiratorial. You can just go test it yourself. You can Google it and figure it out yourself. That's all I had to do. I wrote this book sitting up in my office here. So now every story about the United States-Saudi relationship starts with this claim about the Quincy, where we supposedly promised the Saudis security in return for them promising us all the oil we need. So, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but let's just put it this way. We did not promise anyone security. People write about now because they made this stuff up and it's repeated and it's kind of exaggerated, et cetera. Folks say we had a military alliance, it was tacit, we gave them arms and so forth. None of that happened. It's actually quite the opposite. Saudi Arabia wanted a treaty of alliance. Roosevelt said absolutely not. They wanted arms. Roosevelt said absolutely not. And here comes the big question though. This idea that Roosevelt needed to do something to get oil from Saudi Arabia. That's the part that makes the least sense because the oil was already flowing from Saudi Arabia into, right, the refineries and the global distribution networks of the four firms that were there. The oil was flowing, no security guarantees were offered, and yet we insist, Phyllis insists, a deal is cut there at the time. And it's not just Phyllis, it's not just the left, but the left has this, as I use this term, it's like we want to grab onto that story as if it were the original sin of US capitalism and so forth, okay? So the first time that idea is articulated is after 9/11. We now have, we come to see it as completely believable, right? We all believe it. It's a special relationship going back to FDR. Now, why was it held up at that time after 9/11, right? And why was it embraced? There were meetings in 2005 where folks reenacted that meeting on board the Quincy. Relatives of Ibn Saud, or descendants of Ibn Saud, descendants of Roosevelt, descendants of the translator that was there at the Quincy at the time, get on board, and they love this story. You go to Bruce Rydell, ex-CIA agent at Brookings Institution, you go on, look on his website or look at his book, he tells you it all started with Roosevelt, he cut the deal, we have this. It didn't happen, it just doesn't happen, okay? It's a fiction. It's a fiction not just produced by friends of Saudi Arabia, those who were so worried about the relationship becoming undone, right? Because the folks I can see on the screen clearly remember 9/11. I remember it as well. You might remember Michael Moore producing the biggest documentary, still the biggest grossing documentary in the world. You might remember books that talked about ending the relationship with the Saudis, taking over the oil fields, destroying the Sauds. Well, this was troubling to lots of people who care about the Saudis, et cetera, right? And so they run kind of double time to kind of create this idea that we need the Saudis. Right? Sometimes people go, they have it over, they have us over a barrel, we just have to deal with it, etc. Because supposedly the Saudis do something for us. They deliver us oil. And that somehow, otherwise, somehow what? The oil wouldn't come? Or, people have all sorts of crazy ideas that the Saudis could make the price of oil in response to US policymakers' requests. They're making oil cheap. They do stuff for us. They reduce supply. They raise supply, et cetera, et cetera. None of that happens. It's just bought and sold on the world market. MIT economists back in the 70s said these exact things, right? Policymakers can believe maybe the Saudis are doing you a favor or something, but it's a commodity like any other commodity. Now we have a hard time believing that because we've invested oil with all this like kind of special power, right? And belief, we can go through in the questions and answers what it is that you think the US is doing when it's in the Gulf, right? If you're a right-wing theorist, you believe this. We have to be there to protect the oil, otherwise some enemy is going to take it over. So another good friend of mine, he's not going to like my book, Michael Clare. You might remember him back in 2001, 2002, 2003, saying there's coming war with China because the great powers are vying for control of whatever's left of this commodity that we're running out of because the price is going up. Predictions of wars with China, all that was kind of craziness. Factitious arguments based on no evidence, but deeply held by people. So there's the strategic version that kind of goes, great powers have always fought for oil. The problem being, there's never been an oil war, let alone that people have been doing it for centuries, et cetera. Now, you have another set of folks who imagine that, well, it must be that the United States is there to secure the flow of oil for the world market. That's the beneficent version of hegemony, right? But the United States has not had, you don't have to do anything to secure the flow of oil because it flows. The folks who want to produce it want to sell it. And US military power has never been able to stop a threat or a problem, right? Here, let me reframe it. Military solutions have never been able to resolve problems of, for instance, unrest in the region or refinery fires and so forth. So there is going to be interruptions of all sorts, but we just believe somehow that that military is there doing that for us. It's not true. Now, the left has another version of it. I call this the sophisticated left version, which is the US controls that oil now in the Middle East in order to keep its allies in line. Noam Chomsky has been saying this since the 1960s. So we control it. And as you know, Noam, and I love that man to death, okay, Noam has insisted since 1967 that what the US is doing is controlling oil in the Gulf. That's his first answer to everything, the last time being the Gulf War in 2003. It's just not true. The US, we have, these are either unfalsifiable beliefs, that is, that you got to hold on to them like the belief in God, because you can't prove it. Like, here's the argument that somehow, if the United States is in the Gulf, it's keeping the allies in line. Otherwise, the advanced capitalist economies would rebel against the US hegemonic system, etc. Can we have some proof for that? Can this be falsifiable? Absolutely not, okay? But we believe these things. We repeat them over and over again. Now, why do we believe them? Or, I don't know why you believe them. Why do policymakers make claims like this all the time? Well, they persist in doing so, whether or not they believe them, given the high political costs in being second guessed by their domestic opponents and rivals, okay? You know, so all these arguments, there's a bin Laden-like figure or a Saddam Hussein-like figure is going to appear and he's going to cut off oil supply. This is lunacy. No oil power, no oil producing state has ever cut off oil. Anyone. There's only one country cutting off oil supplies around the world historically, the United States, when it imposes sanctions on oil producing countries. Think about it. Iranian oil can't enter the world market. Venezuelan oil can't enter the world market. The Iraqi oil could not enter the world market, right? Because the United States was sanctioning those folks. So if we think that what United States policy is to secure the flow of oil, we've got this like kind of contradictory idea. We're the only power undermining the flow of oil to the world economy. Now think about those countries that I just named, okay? And I'll stop this in a second. Venezuela, Iraq, and Iran. What would they like to do more than anything else? Sell oil on the world market. Why do they want to sell oil on the world market? They have to keep themselves in power. They have to provide for their militaries, right? That's their resource, etc. It's the same for Saudi Arabia. It will be the same, as I describe in my book, for post-Saudi Arabia. Imagine an Islamic emirate in Arabia. The one thing we could count on from that Islamic emirate in Arabia is the selling oil on the world market, unless the United States comes to see it as an enemy like Venezuela, Iraq, and Iran, and tries to prevent them from doing so. So what does that lead us to believe? That oil's never really been the issue, even though we on the left, and I used to do this myself when in talks in the 80s, believed that oil was everything about US foreign policy. The United States has not had to do anything to secure that oil. So what's the trouble? Let's think about what this means for Saudi. What is the basis of the US-Saudi relationship? What's the trouble? Well, we don't like the rents, right? The profits made from that oil sales when they're in the hands of our enemies. That is a bigger problem for the United States than the flow of oil, which again is guaranteed regardless of our force projection and so forth. So what is the US-Saudi relationship about? Well, you know, think about President Trump. right? Speaking, remember he tells the king, hey, king, we like you a lot, but you couldn't last 2 weeks without us, etc. We protect you, etc. Right? You notice he didn't say anything about guaranteeing the flow of oil. He doesn't need to. So, well, that seems like a very instrumentalist approach to U.S.-Saudi relations, right? The Saudis do things for us. They buy our weapons. You care about this. You care about this phenomenon. Well, that's what they've been doing. That's been the basis of the relationship since the 1970s, when really that alliance or relationship is formed. Forget about Roosevelt, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. None of those, it's kind of irrelevant for this story. But starting in the 70s with the price rises of 73 and so on, you have these countries with this vast amount of wealth. Well, what do the Saudis start doing for the United States? Investing, buying treasury bonds for the United States, bolstering its deficits, buying weapons, buying technology goods, capital goods of all sorts, investing inside the United States, buying campaigns, doing the dirty work for the United States and Central America and so forth. All these arrangements that have nothing to do with oil, save that the oil is what allows the Saudis to pay for this. So, it's what we see as the key factor is really insignificant in some sense. It's the quiet understanding of the White House these days. You just buy oil. You know who's the hero in my book? I hate to say this, Doug Feith. Okay, you remember him, one of the architects of the Gulf War in 2003. But what Feith told Reagan back in the early 80s is you don't have to do anything special to get oil from Saudi Arabia. You just buy it. And the reason why Doug Feith told Reagan that is he learned it from economists at MIT, et cetera. So we've got like the story roughly backward. And it will take another webinar to kind of talk about, well, where do these crazy ideas about resources, commodities come from? Because it's been a belief for most of the 20th century. So Joe Gerson, again, if he's still watching, will remember back during the time of the Vietnam War and before, the left used to argue not that it was oil that mattered to the world or that the United States was out to control the market for oil. We were supposedly out there trying to secure commodities of all sorts, right? And there were arguments that the Vietnam War was really about, getting tungsten for military manufacturers, or the Japanese needed the colonial relationship for those commodities and raw materials. But we never talk about any of those other raw materials anymore. We talked about them incessantly for decades, but it all disappears. You know when? Roughly 1972, 1973, during the oil crisis. All the concerns about all other commodities kind of disappear, and we are instead just convinced, and we rewrite the past to sell this story that the history is really about great powers trying to control this great source of strategic wealth and power. As well, I would drag out Daniel Yergin's big, thick book about this thick, where he articulated these in the late 80s. So we hold to these ideas. They seem to make sense to us, but what I'm arguing here today is that they are factitious. And I gave you one example of the factitious nature of our beliefs about oil power, which is this idea about the United States and Saudi Arabia from 1945 on. And don't take my word for it. You can both go online and Google U.S.-Saudi special relationship. You will find out that you can actually get, you know how if you have kids in high school and they're like buying essays, you can buy an essay that explains traditionally the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia is oil for security, et cetera. And I'm sort of saying we've never had to do anything to get the oil. And here's the other thing. We've never made a commitment to secure the Saudis in power. And if the Saudis thought, if the Saudis think that, right, they'd be kind of stupid too. and which is, and I think the conclusion is no Saudi actually believes the United States is ready when push comes to shove to preserve the Al Saud in power. We've talked about, I'm really just stealing this idea from the country's best expert on US-Saudi relations. He sort of said, we've made a commitment to the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia, but we don't, we've never promised the Al Saud that we will preserve them in power. We have no evidence for that. So I know that was a lot. I told you it was going to drive you crazy. Let's go from there.
Thanks, Professor Vitalis. You promised that you would drive us crazy, and you have challenged a lot of my preconceived notions on this subject. But I'm happy to have them challenged and look at this in a different way. We want to welcome everyone to ask your questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. But for that, I am going to be turning it over to Professor Prasannan Parthasarathi, who's a board member of Massachusetts Peace Action and a key member on our Middle East working group. I'm sure you have a few questions of your own. Perhaps you'd like to start right there. Take it away, Prasannan.
Thank you, Brian. I actually want to start with a question from a participant from Sung Hee John. And she writes, Bob, why do you think they fabricated this myth and perpetuated it? Are there some geopolitical reasons behind this myth? And if so, what are they?
Well, I don't know. There is not like this agent who's doing this, okay, in some sense. But why have we, so I asked the question, why have we come to believe it? We've come to believe it. Let's go to Phyllis Bennis and making that claim on that stage for which there is no archival evidence, no book that ever recounts that story, etc. Why does she believe it? I think it serves to reinforce deeply held beliefs about the nature, for the left, the nature of the US state, and who is supposedly behind the US state for so many leftists, for so many decades? Big oil, right, and so forth. So somehow it's something about big oil, capital, and then the more sophisticated guys kind of go, we are really in the world of fossil capital, and oil is like the key to our whole civilization and way of life in some sense. So it affirms these deeply held beliefs about the nature of the U.S. state and so forth. So that's the left, okay? Why do friends of Saudi Arabia believe it or propagate it? They think it's true too. It seems like it makes perfect sense to them. Roosevelt goes to meet Ibn Saud. Of course he's going to be talking about oil. Do you know what they were actually talking about? Palestine. This is the famous meeting where Roosevelt says, hey, Ibn Saud, I need your help on this Palestine question. We've got a problem coming up, etc. Will you help me? And of course, Roosevelt gets grumpy because Ibn Saud says absolutely not. This is like nuts. And the way and the documents from the State Department describe this. Roosevelt's getting grumpier and grumpier. They agree to disagree. Roosevelt makes a promise though to Ibn Saud, right? We will not do anything on the question of Palestine without consulting you first. And then what happens? Roosevelt dies. President Truman comes into power, and Truman, as you know, goes on and recognizes Israel without consulting the Saudis. In every book for decades, talk about that meeting in those grounds around questions of Palestine, right? So why do folks forget that stuff now and hold up this idea? I'm going to call them the friends of Saudi Arabia. Why do they hold that up? Well, they believe it too. These two leaders, these two leaders are meeting in our mindsets of 9/11, 2001. or post-1973, when we're convinced oil is the most important commodity in the world, we project back onto the past our fears, our anxiety, our anxieties and so forth. Plus, and this is what matters to you folks in some sense, it is a noxious regime that we support. Right? The butchers that killed Khashoggi, that have their own kin in prisons right now, that are has not changed its political system since basically the time that Ibn Saud founded the state in 1932. If anything, it's gotten harsher and more repressive in a way. Well, that's a problem. We wouldn't like that kind of regime normally. So what are we told all the time? Well, we're kind of stuck because we need the oil. Or some folks argue today, well, hey, now that we have energy independence and we're fracking like crazy, we don't need the Saudis anymore. We'll be able to survive without them, which is also a fiction, right? Because there is no truth about energy independence. Because if you notice this in the pandemic, you asked me early on, well, what's the relationship of oil in the pandemic? Well, one thing we know is oil prices, the price of oil is set on a world market, right? So the United States has no independence from that world oil market. We were not big fans of fracking, but if you had invested in shale, you'd be in trouble right now, right? So there's no independence from the global supply or the supply disruptions, the world market supply and demand and so forth. But we want to believe. We either want to believe or we're told we need Saudi Arabia, that it does these special things for us. So.
All right. Well, Cole Harrison from Napa has sent in a question, and this really follows up on the previous one. And he quotes Jimmy Carter, who wrote in 1980, "The region which is now threatened by Soviet troops in Afghanistan is of great strategic importance. It contains more than 2/3 of the world's exportable oil." And so it's brought Soviet military forces to within 300 miles of the Indian Ocean and close to the Straits of Hormuz, the waterway through which most of the world's oil must flow. So how do we explain this idea then shaping US foreign policy? I mean, oil flows, but this idea is not only something that's on the left, but it also seems to be something that has guided US policymakers for the last few decades.
Well, so there's a couple of things I want to say about that. Many of you will know Andrew Bacevich, right? God bless him. He blurbs my new book. So I love him to death, even though he's a conservative and I'm ostensibly a lefty, though you will not believe that after this talk. Bacevich asks this great question. And remember, as the past fades from view, we have these more and more kind of caricaturish accounts of them, okay? So there was supposedly this great energy crisis in 1973 that supposedly threw the world economy into a tailspin that, forever changed the United States, as folks were talking about at that time. So here's the funny thing Bacevich asks. There is nothing in any Pentagon document for the next 6 years talking about, so the Pentagon has to develop, a yearly and 3-year planning document. So what are the basic threats to the United States, national security, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing about oil. Hardly mentioned at all. Not any part of the 70s. Then two things happen. Besides that, Carter has to run for re-election against the right, and loses. The Shah falls, and the Soviets enter Afghanistan. And you get the construction of these crazy geopolitical scenarios, right? That, I mean, I don't know how else to say this. I have Fred Halliday's here. No, I don't have it there. Fred Halliday's old book, The Myth of the Ark of Crisis. You get these kind of crazy stories in the 70, 79, 80, 81. The Soviets are coming. They're going to take over. They want the warm water ports of the Persian Gulf. This is how I met Joe Gerson, because he was working against the US militarization of the Persian Gulf at that time in response to the so-called Soviet menace. Well, we know that that stuff was all crazily exaggerated, right? Constructed, right? Both so that Jimmy Carter can, both because he has advisors who believe it, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and under Brzezinski, Sam Huntington was the person writing these documents, but we also have accounts from the Washington Post sort of saying Sam Huntington's point is to scare people into upping the defense budget. Now, how are you going to increase the defense budget after a few years of declines, right, in the 70s? This was the grounds for it. Now, but the real question is, what was do you need the military to secure flows of oil in the Persian Gulf? And what I'm trying to argue to you is you do not. They did nothing. There is no proof. You cannot, think like an economist for a second. You cannot demonstrate that the presence of the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Persian Gulf has either lowered the price of oil, right, or increased the quantities provided by that region, right, in ways that would not be true without the military being there. So we have this idea that the military is there. You either believe it, the Soviets are coming, and lots of people believe that stuff, even though it was kooky. Why was it kooky? The Soviets were a major oil producer, and they were busy gearing up production in Soviet Central Asia at the time, and the West Germans were investing in producing more natural gas from Soviet fields. The Soviets were actors in the world market at that time. They had no interest in the Gulf, as they kept telling Reagan administration, and we have this confirmed from declassified records after the fall of the Soviet Union. They understood that the Persian Gulf was a U.S. sphere of influence. They'd be kooky to want to go to war or go to war to secure this thing that they don't need because they have it anyway. And you could ask the further question of a guy like Brzezinski, who, whatever you think about him, can't explain how a barrel of oil gets to market, right? He instead, Brzezinski, Huntington, these characters all see the world like a risk board. I don't know if you've ever played Risk as a kid. You got the maps, you're moving the territories around. That is their view of geography and strategy right out of Risk. And that's what Doug Feith has said. And I should say one more thing. In the oil crisis, et cetera, you have the birth of this whole new industry called energy security analysts. And every energy security analyst, strategist, et cetera, would be talking about the Soviet threat, et cetera. But I don't know what else to say. I don't know what else to say about that. It was this kind of pumped up threat to raise defense budgets, right? To maybe not let Reagan come into power, because that was a problem for Jimmy Carter. The Carter turns rightward, but we have there was no evidence that folks saw at the beginning of the oil crisis that one would need to go abroad to secure the flow of oil. This was an invention of the Jimmy Carter into Reagan era, basically.
Okay, but then, and this is a minor point, but you say that Chomsky started articulating this in the 60s. So where did this come from? But I think more importantly is, so the US is in this region of the world basically because of some exaggerated threat in order to maintain its levels of military spending. Is that the bottom line?
And well, it's there for a number of reasons. And not to say that generals don't believe in this risk view that we got to control the resources because otherwise someone else is going to take those resources. there's just no empirical proof of that, right, proposition. But these beliefs about states going to war for commodities, for control of commodities of all types, was a kind of mindset of the entire 20th century, right? You know, I can give you so many examples of this. The Great Britain, British officials in the 30s arguing, well, here's why it most matters. If decolonization takes place, if we lose our empires, now why do we have those empires? Raw materials. Why do we need to be there? Because, you know, the heathens can't produce the materials that we need for our Western way of life. And hence, you know, they started to believe things like these materials are the common heritage of mankind. They belong to the folks that can actually produce them. With these exaggerated ideas that if we don't control these things, right, England will collapse. England will collapse if it loses its colonies. I cannot tell you how many times that was put forward. Or how Germany, Italy, in the 1930s started arguing as have-not countries, we need to have our colonies because, you know, we're going to all, you know, we need the raw materials that it secures. These are like deeply held beliefs for all of the 20th century. But for some reason, post 72 and 73, it's really about oil. So, you know, it's just somehow oil is the only commodity. Now, Chomsky, you know, he reads, well, there's a couple of things. He is from that mindset, right? The US state acts in the interests of capital as a whole, or in big firms, big oil and so forth. Big everything, right? So it's something, I mean, he has said it over and over again, going back to the 60s. Again, but in the 60s, it was all about all sorts of commodities. It's only in the 70s that he starts talking about oil and finding the records that say something like this. Oil is a tremendous source of strategic power in the Middle East, which we need to control. So Chomsky goes, oh, there's the proof. It's in the archives. The US guy is saying this. But he never asks, what is that control? How does that work? Because the argument I would make to you is the United States has never controlled oil. In order to think that, you have to, like Phyllis did in that talk in the clip I gave you, you conflate two things: the United States government and the oil firms. The oil firms definitely control that oil until 1972, meaning they made the production decisions about them, right? And somehow, you know, in policymakers, Britain used to say this about their oil companies. The United States used to say this about their oil companies. Our companies are there. We somehow control these things. But when they investigate this and try to figure it out, we have these records going, you know, we actually don't control it because we don't have any way of shaping, right, what the companies themselves do in a way. So the false beliefs, the factitious beliefs, the beliefs without empirical verification that are found in the records are all known needs to kind of, you know, make this general claim over and over again that it's about control of oil. So we made it about 2003. The main reason the United States occupied Iraq was to control the oil. Well, how's that going? Right? Again, you know, let me say one more thing about this. You notice that oil goes up and down as a problem. But are we talking about it now? I mean, except, you know, we're worried about we're worried about how little it costs, right? I mean, you know, and the only people who care about that is Texas, you know, Pennsylvania fracking, et cetera. I mean, to most consumers, it's a great thing. But oil appears and disappears from our view about problems in foreign policy, right? Well, what that means is that oil is reflective of some other things going on. It is not oil per se that's the problem, but it's used for other reasons. And I'm just stealing that line from, believe it or not, President Obama's science advisor, 20 years before he became President Obama's science advisor. He said, you know, where he sort of said, there's no, you know, states don't go to war for oil. There's no struggle over this, but we might do it if we didn't think hard enough about, you know, how commodities are secured, et cetera.
All right, well, this has been very provocative, and we have about 5 minutes left, but I think an important question to end our discussion with today is, how does shifting to your perspective and adopting this view of oilcraft, and I really like that term, oilcraft, what should the peace movement be doing differently? How does it affect, how should we rethink some of the things that we're doing, especially some of the work that we at MAPA have been doing on really trying to change the US-Saudi relationship, ending arms sales to the Saudis because of what's going on, the Saudi war in Yemen, and so on and so forth. I mean,
Yeah, so
how does this change what we do?
so you come into opposition when you make these claims about why we should be doing this thing. We've got this authoritarian regime that is militarizing the region. We've helped to destroy Yemen at the same time. We're in bed with a criminal, basically, though we're supposed to celebrate him because he wants to create, he wants to give money to MIT or have, robot cities, et cetera, and so forth. We can leave that aside for now. Well, why are you doing this, right? And what is the argument? We have to. Saudi Arabia is key to, kind of the flow of oil. They keep the prices low. They make more oil available than otherwise it would be, and none of those are true. So we have a great response to folks, which is, it's not true. We've never needed them. They have never done anything to secure the flow, to provide oil to us versus other consumers, right, at lower prices or at greater volumes than if we had done any of those things, right? So it forces the state, it forces the government, right? If we push this line enough, it forces the government to have to come up with new excuses for the support for Saudi Arabia, or it exposes it for what it is. It's material transactions. It's Brookings getting money from the Saudis. It's MIT, Arkansas getting money from the Saudis. It's politicians getting money. The Raytheons of the world, et cetera. All of those claims are somehow supposedly for the greater security, of the international system. And, you don't have to take my word for it. I would point you to MIT's Barry Posen. Okay, Barry Posen is not a lefty. He's a consultant to the Pentagon, and he's written a book a few years back it's basically a book called Restraint, Why We Need to Rethink U.S. Global Military Policy. And Barry Posen says, we need to get out of the Gulf. Because now this is him, cost-benefit analysis. Nothing the United States has done has been able to stop crises from taking place, or has been able to, or needs to secure oil. Because whoever's in Saudi Arabia, this is where I started from, is going to sell it. Like every other oil power. Bin Laden had an oil policy, right? But somehow we have, we can deal with racism some other time. This idea that I say goes back to the 20s, that somehow Arabs, Venezuelans, Latin Americans can't be trusted, right, to provide the resources that we need, except they have. And again, all those other resources we don't think about anymore, and so forth. And, Joe, anyway, I'll stop it there.
Well, thank you, Bob. You've given us a lot of food for thought. It's been a really stimulating hour, and we thank you so much for taking your time and presenting your work to us, and really forcing us to think hard about how we go about our own work. And let me turn it over to Brian now, who will give some final words.
Thanks, Prasanan, and thank you, Bob. My biggest takeaway from this is that maybe we have given some magical properties to the idea of oil, and really that maybe more than being about oil, this is really about money. I want to let everyone know about a webinar that we're going to be putting on tomorrow night at 6:30, which takes a closer look at one of the most important companies involved in the subject we were talking about tonight. It even came up. We're going to be explaining our Raytheon campaign and how you can join it to oppose the military-industrial complex right here in Massachusetts. And I want to thank Bob again for your presentation. You're definitely have challenged some of my thinking, but I think that is a good thing. And I'm certainly going to re-examine some of the beliefs that I went into this. And then I'm looking forward to reading your book, Oilcraft, which you can get from Amazon. It should be coming out in the next couple of months, and I hope, Bob, that you get a copy as well sooner rather than later. But I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for this webinar of our Middle East Working Group, and we look forward to seeing you all very soon. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this program, as well as some helpful links, and included in that will be a way that you can register to attend tomorrow's webinar on the Raytheon anti-war campaign. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Prasanan, and we hope everyone has a wonderful night, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.